When I was creating my song Sweet Destruction, I decided to hire a real violin player. So I went onto Fiverr and I found Alex, and she was more than qualified to play my parts. Now I noticed on her profile that she was from Ukraine, so I started asking her questions because I was quite concerned for her welfare. This is a report about the war in Ukraine and also about the personal situation of Alex and her husband Roman during the conflict. On the morning of February 24th, 2022, Alex got a phone call early in the morning from her parents saying that Russia had invaded. Now the war had affected many Ukrainians' lives. Many lost their jobs. A lot of people had fled. The men in Ukraine did not leave as that they had to be there for military support. For 7 months, the couple remained at their home. They're from the country's capital, Kyiv, which is also a war zone. Now they were unemployed for that whole time. Their only source of income was from the Fall website, which they did session work from. They would only leave their home for supplies. Life was tough then. They didn't know what they would do. Alex and Roman have had a long history of playing orchestras under contract. They have worked on cruise ships and also in South Korea. Roman would play piano and Alex by his side playing violin. It really has brought them close together. The couple met 14 years ago at a music academy. They had to play as a duo in a chamber class. They soon became friends and then a little later on became a couple. To this day, they still play as a duo. A stroke of luck came their way. After many months of trying to survive, the previous orchestra manager called them and offered them a place in the European tour. He requested permission from the government for all male orchestrants to leave the country. His request was granted under the cultural minister. Male artists can leave the country and go abroad to represent Ukraine. This has been a blessing because Alex and Roman can now have protection and receive an income. They usually go back home between tours, but it's still not safe. Some of their friends who have moved to Europe have come back home, because after all, home is home. You see, the war in Ukraine is a result of a complicated relationship with Russia, and it's lasted for a very long time, and it's built up to what we see now. The two nations have the same ancestral roots, dating back to the 9th century. The countries that we know as Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus formed the state that was known as the Kievan-Rus. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, the Norsemen, also known as Vikings, came from Swedish lands and sailed across the Baltic Sea in search of the dirham, a high-grade silver coin that was traded in the region from the Arabs and made it back to Sweden. The Norsemen, or Sea Kings, would create trade routes from the Baltic Sea through to the Black and the Caspian Seas and trade with the empires, such as the Byzantine Empire. The Norse people weren't just traders, but conquerors as well. They became rulers of many Slavic and Finnish trading towns. The Norsemen were later referred to as the Rus people, probably based on their language, meaning a crew of oarsmen. In 882, Prince Oleg came from the ancient settlement Novgorod and laid the groundwork for the Kievan-Rus. He formed an army of Vikings and Slavs and captured ancient Kiev and made it the capital of the Rus kingdom. The Rus also included Slavic tribes who they previously waged war on. In 1223, the Kievan-Rus was destroyed by the Mongol conquest. After the invasion, it became disunified and broke away. The Mongols occupied the region for centuries. The Grand Duchy of Moscow would rise, which became the new center of the Rus people. When the Mongol presence left, Ukraine was swallowed up into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Polish Queen and the Lithuanian Duchy married and formed the Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Cossack people, who among them rebelled against the Commonwealth in favour of joining the Grand Duchy of Moscow. During this time, it had been slowly forming to what we know as Russia, starting from 1371. The Cossack people signed a treaty to form an allegiance to the Russian Tsar and break away from the Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia would finally see this as a reunion of the Rus people, including Ukraine. This sentiment has run throughout history up until present Russian politics. The war in Ukraine is yet another sentiment to bring the Rus people together, a scene played out through Russian history again and again. But what they fail to realise is that the Kievan-Rus was broken, and the people that made it what it was had evolved. Ukraine's culture and language was largely determined by its association with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For Russia trying to reunite them under the Rus people has been a justification to keep its power intact. This is why Russia has forced a brotherhood between the two nations throughout history, and this has finally cracked to become war today. Ukraine has had its own cultural identity, which is steering away from the original Rus. The capital Kyiv has been in existence since then. Ukraine in the past has always been a part of Russia, and this is where the trouble starts. Putin does not recognise that Ukraine should have its own sovereignty. Ukraine and Russia were essentially the same country, along with 15 other states. It was the world's biggest country and the world's biggest superpower. When the Soviet Union collapsed, those 15 states became their own independent countries, along with Ukraine. Ukraine had the privilege of electing their first president, but Russia saw this independence as unjust and unfair. See, to Putin, having Ukraine as a separate nation is a threat to Russian power. Ukraine has a very strong food supply, known as the breadbasket, and it also has strong oil and gas reserves, which is important to Russia. Russia distributes most of its oil and gas through Ukraine. If Ukraine became its own separate nation, it would be in direct competition with Russia. Russia is also dependent on Ukraine's strong resources and food. No accident that where Russia has invaded in the Donbass region is where there are large reserves of coal. Another reason why he's invaded is the perceived threat from NATO. NATO is a military alliance between Western Europe and America. NATO also has its own military who have bases in the bordering countries of Russia. The advantages of being signed to a NATO country is that all the other NATO countries become an ally. Putin sees NATO's presence as an act of aggression, but NATO is not at war with Putin. Both Ukraine and Russia are not NATO members. Russia sees Ukraine as a buffer between him and the rest of the NATO countries. If Ukraine becomes a NATO member, that will prove a threat to Putin, because that would mean that NATO will be on his border. But NATO will not sign Ukraine or Russia to be NATO, even if they want to. It proves too much of a threat to the rest of the world. This is also not the first invasion of Ukraine. In 2014, Russia took occupation of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. It all started when a Ukrainian president wanted to strengthen relations with Russia. He failed to sign a political and trade agreement with the European Union, or the EU. This led to violent protests between Ukrainians and police, which killed many people, including pro-Russian activists. This is what sparked the uprising against Ukraine. During the protests, Russia's armed military came in unannounced with unmarked troops and tanks to back up pro-Russian separatists, to seize government buildings and military bases. The Russian military was dubbed the Little Green Men. When Ukraine questioned their moves, they denied it was even them. He saw the instability of Ukrainian politics as a chance to swipe in and be one step closer to reclaiming Ukraine. The leaders of Crimea signed a treaty with Putin to become a state of Russia. This led to the illegal act of annexation, which is when a country forcibly changes its borders. Russia turned to propaganda on Ukrainian TV to influence the hearts and minds of the people in Crimea. These areas were heavily Russian-speaking also, and some minority groups were ethnically Russian. For Russia to take control again and annexing the area was a natural progression. This move on Crimea and the Donbas region is nothing new. This same tactic has been made on other countries who are ex-Soviet states. This includes Georgia in 2008, Ikaria in 1994 to 1999, which is now the Czech Republic, and Moldova right below Ukraine. All have regions of Russian occupation within them. The conflict in Moldova is kind of a hybrid war along with Ukraine, but the conflict in Moldova is largely silent with the media. It has a Russian-occupied state known as Transnistria, which has been used as a strategic position against Ukraine. For an empire like Russia to keep its power, it has to keep growing through invasion. The Soviet Union breakup was a huge loss for Russia, and it wants to maintain control over its Western NATO neighbours. Now 8 years later, he began his full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. But why did he wait so long? The answer is not so clear. Some reports say it was a last-minute decision. Some say it was to wedge more of a distance between him and the West. It's Putin's sweet destruction, if you can call it that. To keep up with the latest news of the war, there'll be links below. There'll also be links to Alex's Fiverr page so you can hire her and her talent, and there'll also be a link to Ukraine's military aid. Thanks for watching.